A sneak peek at what's coming up next.
Schools are made to be cookie cutter, right? You have the general population of students, and they have this one approach that they use for all of the classes, right? Treat special needs, I guess, the same way. It's like we just put you in there, and the teacher does their best to work with what they have in there.
So we pull from about 22 different research-based techniques depending on what's right for each student. So there's so many strategies, so many techniques out there. One strategy that we might teach them is the estimated time versus the actual time strategy.
You were involved in research when it comes to education. Was there anything that you found like very surprising that you learned?
Well, my research really was about identifying the most optimal method for teaching reading comprehension to students who have learning disabilities. And what I found is that using a visualization approach really makes such a big difference. Teaching kids to form visual images in their minds of what they're reading or what they're listening to really helps them to comprehend the information.
Get ready for peak autism infotainment. Thrilling topics, amazing guests, great laughs, and autism.
On the Spectrum, an autistic podcast.
I meant to say elixir, but I said liquor. My bad.
All right, welcome to another wonderful episode of On the Spectrum podcast. My name is Steve.
And I'm Nick.
And today we have a special guest with us today. Dr. Emily Levy is here to join us today.
Yay.
She is the founder and director of EBL Coaching. So, Emily, you want to say hello?
Yes, hi there. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So, I read a little bit about your bio before you decided to hop on, and I had some questions kind of planned ahead of time for you. You mainly study or have studied education, so you have a few different degrees. You have a doctorate in education, correct?
Correct, yes.
And what made you decide to study education?
Great question. I had kind of a circuitous path to coming into education. I grew up in the field of special education. My mother was actually the founder of a school for students with learning disabilities down in Florida, which is where I grew up. So I kind of spent much of my childhood working at her school, observing kids with special education needs, but decided I wanted to carve my own path initially. So I went to Brown as an undergraduate, and then I went into finance for 2 years. Quickly realized that was not for me. And I really recalled how fulfilling and how much I loved working at my mother's school and working with kids. So it was really at that point that I pivoted. I decided to get my master's degree in special education and my doctorate in education while starting to tutor kids with special education needs and then eventually growing it into EBL Coaching, where I now oversee the tutoring that we do.
Have you ever worked in any public schools?
I have not taught in a public school. My specialty has always been one-on-one remediation, initially myself, and then eventually I brought on tutors who specialize in different skill areas. That's always been my specialty.
And as you know, we focus on autism, ADHD, and stuff like that. So I'm sure there's a lot of parents out there who have autistic children. A lot of the people who listen to us are actually parents of autistic kids or older autistic adults.
Absolutely.
It's okay. I thought you were going to say something.
No, I was letting you do your thing.
Oh, all right.
Well, it's your guest.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. You're smart.
So you pivoted into special education and you do mostly one-on-one. So how did you start EBL Coaching? And sorry, I was going to also add to that. What would you say the mission is for EBL Coaching?
What exactly is EBL?
Great question. So EBL Coaching is the tutoring program that I founded, where we specialize in providing one-on-one tutoring to special education students, including students who have autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, speech and language challenges, and so on. In terms of how I got started, I began tutoring students myself, actually on the side when I was living in Manhattan and doing finance during the day. I started tutoring kids at night and on the weekends with special education needs, and pretty quickly realized what a need there was for these kinds of tutoring services, these specialized tutoring services. So I ended up leaving my job in finance and just slowly and organically started to bring on other tutors who specialize in different skill areas, whether it's reading, writing, math, executive functioning skills, younger kids, older kids, and then eventually grew it into what EBL coaching is today, where we have a learning center. And then we also do virtual tutoring, actually worldwide now.
Nice.
In terms of our mission, I would say it's really to provide remediation and develop academic skills and confidence for students who have specialized learning needs.
That's awesome. Can you give an example of what a specialized learning need would be?
Sure. Well, it's really the kinds of students that we work with. So students who have a learning disability or who struggle with the skill or a set of skill, reading, writing, math, and so on. Students who might have ADHD and they have trouble with executive functioning skills and need help with skills like planning, organization, time management. So I would tell you that that whole category of skills is what we specialize in.
Okay. So you kind of go from educational skills and life skills from what it sounds like.
Yeah, we do build in some life skills as well. More academic, but yes, we do great life skills.
Those two things are kind of intertwined quite a lot, you know? Yeah. So does EBL stand for anything in particular?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I knew you asked me that. So it actually stands for two things.
Excellent.
One is my initials, Emily Beth Levy, and the other one is evidence-based learning. Since all of the work we do is all evidence-based and multisensory and catered to the needs of each student.
Excellent. Okay. So I like it when things are dual purpose like that.
So,
that's nice.
I don't know as far as like the scale, because when I didn't look up like how big your company actually is, but like on a scale, like how many students do you guys service or help?
Yeah, at any given time, we usually have about 300 students, give or take. And some are, like I said, local in the New York, New Jersey area, and then many are national or international that we help virtually.
That is, wow, that's a lot of students.
Would you say that there are certain challenges that might be harder with the virtual versus in person?
You know, over the years, we've developed great resources and technology to engage with the students as though we're in person. So we've actually found it to be really effective and such a great way to help students who might live in a geographic area where they don't necessarily have access to this kind of tutoring in person. So it's really allowed us to spread our wings and to help so many more kids.
This is not on my question list, but it might be a little more controversial. But have you ever like, are there certain struggles you get into when it comes to the parents? Like maybe parents have certain expectations versus because you did a lot of research and you have a doctorate and you have a master's and you have a lot of knowledge when it comes to special education and education. Do you ever run into any issues with like maybe parents' expectations versus what you believe to be the best practices are?
Yes. So, there are different iterations of that. Sometimes, for instance, we might have a parent who wants their child to get help with algebra, but they don't have basic fact fluency yet. So we need to really take it down a notch and say, well, we can't really help them with algebra until we build the basic math foundation. So I think we try to really approach it from an educational standpoint, from this is what we're going to do to help your child, and we will help get them to that point, but we need to really build those foundations. So sometimes initially there's a little bit of a mismatch, but usually once we have that conversation and have that dialogue, typically the parents tend to get on board.
And actually on that expectation thing, is there ever times where I'm going to be cautious in my wording here. Nope, that wouldn't be me. So I'm just going to say it my way. Is there ever a time where the parent has much higher expectation or a much higher desire for where they want their kid to be than actually the kid wants to be or even the kid's able to be? Is there ever a time where that kind of comes into conflict?
Well, sometimes there are many cases where the student might have a really high IQ, they're very bright, but they're just not motivated, or they don't have the organizational skills, and they just don't have the tools to achieve what a parent might want them to achieve, or even what they're capable of.
It sounds like a lot of kids with ADHD.
Definitely a lot. Exactly.
I struggled in school when I was younger, and I was very good at test taking. I did very well when it came to tests. But I didn't do any of the work. I didn't study. I didn't do my homework. I would ace all of my tests, but the way that I learned was I would listen, and whatever they told me, I could regurgitate it back to you. I remember to retain information like a sponge, but I struggled in a lot of other areas. So,
And I was similar to that too. And the reason why I asked that question is because I've worked in elementary schools at times, and I've worked with adults who always say, especially when they're low support need autistic people, they have tendency to talk about how their parents and their teachers and everybody says they have such great potential. How come they can't meet it? And it's always that idea that they have this belief that they should be X, but their level of effort, if you will, or just where they want to be is not quite where everybody else says, and people treat them as such, right? And so I can imagine you're having a conversation with a parent, and the parent's like, yeah, I know my kid full well can do 8 times 9, but they're just not doing it. Okay, well, maybe they're struggling with, something that's a little lesser in math.
Or maybe some social issues that creep in there. And
yeah, or maybe there's
you're insecure. If a lot of people who are autistic, ADHD, obviously there's the social factor where they have, social development, or they were struggling with their peers. And it's like, maybe all those other pressures are causing you not to, I don't want to do my homework. I don't want to focus on things because my life is a mess and I have no friends. And
For sure. It's all intertwined. Without a doubt.
So I always wonder that from people who focus on special education, like how do you mitigate that kind of expectation between the two if it's a miss, if not? That's kind of, All right. I think I said a full question there somewhere.
About having a lot of honest, realistic conversations with parents without turning them away, of course, but really saying,
of course,
we truly believe we can help your child. These are the methods your child needs, but we need to build the basic foundations before we can do 8th grade level work if they're at a 2nd grade level. So it's just a matter of having the right approach, the right dialogue with parents, really help get them on board.
I think if someone's coming to you, they're obviously looking for somebody who's an expert anyway. So they're asking for help. So those parents that come to you are probably going to be less resistant anyway. And somebody else who's not coming to you, the ones who are maybe a little more hard-headed or inflexible are probably not the people coming to you. So.
Exactly. I think you're right.
Probably. I just figured I'd ask.
No, that's fine. Listen, I'm a layman, okay? You have like 8 degrees. I have like nothing. So I don't know what I'm talking about.
That's okay. That's okay. We still believe in you, Steve. Okay. So beyond his, taking care of his ego there. So if I can ask, what would be, obviously without giving any names, because I don't want you to divulge who you worked with, but has there ever been a time where there was a really tough case for you or with one of the other people who works with you, like a really tough student and it was hard to get through to, and how did you kind of navigate that situation?
Yeah. So, I think some of the most challenging cases that we've had are the kids who have severe behavior challenges. I think sometimes, if a child is not willing, if we show up for a session and they're just sitting under the desk and won't come out, then we know that child really needs behavior support before they're ready to even address the learning piece. So sometimes there's limitations like that. But then there's other times where a child might be just very non-focused and disorganized initially, and we have to kind of channel that in and build their focus for longer stretches of time and build in multisensory activities so that we can both build their focusing skills but also build their academic skills. So I think every child is unique and different, and it's a matter of really gauging who that child is, assessing their needs, and then coming up with the tutoring plan accordingly.
Okay.
I had so when I was reading through your bio, you said it says in your bio that you were involved in research when it comes to education. Was there anything that you found very surprising that you learned, or methods that maybe were non-traditional or different than the way that people normally approach education that you were surprised by?
Well, my research really was about identifying the most optimal method for teaching reading comprehension to students who have learning disabilities. And what I found is that using a visualization approach really makes such a big difference. Teaching kids to form visual images in their minds of what they're reading or what they're listening to really helps them to comprehend the information. And I think if we could build more of that into our classrooms, it would help that many more kids. But I think really particularly students who have learning disabilities tend to respond very well to building in visualization.
Yeah, kind of an alternative way to the way they teach in a regular classroom, whatnot. Yeah.
This is very non-scientific, but I was listening to somebody recently because I don't know anything about this. They were talking about different ways that people think. Some people have an internal monologue that they speak with, and some people don't really have an internal monologue. Maybe they think more in pictures, or but I find that interesting. I wonder if a lot of the students are in special education programs or have learning challenges, like if there's one way that they think that's like maybe different from the average of other people. I find it interesting that a large percentage of the population doesn't have an internal monologue, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think there is any one way. I think it really varies on a student by student basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like thinking styles themselves. Everybody got, some people are rather similar in their thinking style, but most people have a different way in which they go about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when it comes to education in general with special education students, are there certain strategies that work better than others? Besides, you talked about the reading thing when you were doing research, but like just overall when it comes to anything.
Yeah, I would say really using a multisensory approach tends to help almost every child, whether they're a visual learner or a linear learner or auditory learner. When we engage the senses with tools like magnetic tiles and colored sand and whiteboards, these tools that engage their senses, it really helps for the new information to stick in their long-term memory. So and there's a lot of research that supports this, using a multisensory approach does wonders for these kinds of students.
So the more you engage different senses while you're learning something, the easier it is for you to retain and remember the information.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yes.
So that's a good reason why when we're younger, when you go on field trips and stuff, it helps you remember that stuff. Right?
It builds significance to it. Yeah.
You can attach a memory to it.
Right.
It's easier to have the memory. Like if I have a certain smell or certain sensory thing that reminds me of something that I learned.
Well, it kind of reminds me of like state-based learning. Like if you're studying for a test and you're listening to music in the background, you're more likely to remember what you studied if you have that same song or music playing in the background when you go to take that test. Granted, most teachers don't let you rock out to, AC/DC while you're in the middle of a history exam.
Right.
Although I still tried to anyway. But that's just me. I'm not the best student in the world.
But if that works for you, then that works for you.
Yeah. And actually, I had a really good experience when I was finishing up my bachelor's degree. I had a professor who noticed that, like, I wouldn't show up to class a lot, and and they weren't necessarily concerned because I was picking up the information. And they said to me, "What would keep your butt in the seat? Because I need to have your butt in the seat." He was like, "I know you've learned what I needed you to learn, but for the school, I need your butt in the seat. How am I going to get you to do it?" And I said, "TV." And he goes, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Let me watch shows on my phone. I'll have headphones in. Nobody will know I'm doing it. I always sit in the back of the room anyway. Let me do that." And he goes, "Great. Show up to every class." I was like, "All right." And so I showed up to every single class, and my grades never slipped. And I just sat there watching TV on my phone. Yeah. I really appreciate that he did that because he recognized
TV learning method.
Yes. Well, I appreciate it because he recognized that I was different than other people. And then this is before I got diagnosed. But he recognized that I was still learning. I was still getting the information I needed to get. I was still doing well on my projects and my exams, but I just wouldn't show up. And the school demanded, like, he didn't agree with attendance being part of your grade. Just like me, I don't agree with attendance being part of a grade, but he said, but the school needs that. And so due to that, how do we make this work between the two of us? And it was really cool that he was more than willing to do that, because some teachers were like, screw that guy. He's non-compliant. He's got to switch to a different class, which was all right. I mean, I learned very specifically at that point that, some teachers are out for them.
Yeah.
Not all, but some. Yeah.
It sounds like the theme that I'm getting from you is that, like, when we ask questions, or I think, I'm not a parent, but I imagine that parents are looking for answers for things all the time.
Yes.
And whenever we speak about subjects, we speak in generalities, right? But it sounds like what you're saying is it's really more of an individual student approach. Like, I guess if you were going to be, like, I've worked as a manager, right? And from that perspective, that's how I'm thinking about it. When you work with an employee one-on-one, you have to cater your approach to the employee based on how they are, what their motivations are, and who they are as a person. I guess it's the same thing when it comes to education.
Absolutely. And especially special education. It's really a matter of identifying that student's needs and then pulling from the right research-based techniques based on what's best for them. So definitely diagnostic and prescriptive, and really individualizing the instruction.
Absolutely. I mean, it's good to hear that people are focusing more on that, because I know when I was going to school, when I was a kid, rather, high school in the 90s, let me put a time frame on it. Back in the 90s, even the kids in the special ed rooms, or the kids that had specialized learning, they weren't really looking at them as individuals. There was still a cookie cutter approach to it.
It's a monolith.
Yeah, like, because not all special education kids have the same, not only special needs, but also have the same issues that bring them there. Right? Like there's a
You
ton
put them
of
all in
different
one room, even
developmental
though they all have
differences.
Yeah, they all have different reasons why they're there, but they put them in one room and treat them all the same.
Right. Specifically, I've got friends who have dyslexia and dyscalculia, and both of them yet were treated the same. As if they were just slower. And if we just talk to you slower, have you read less at any given time, that's better. One of them didn't have a problem with reading, but yet that was still the curriculum in those classes.
Right.
You know, I mean, so I'm glad things are getting better, and I'm glad people are like yourself who are following more of an approach of,
well, I think
let's
from
see
the
what that kid needs,
to defend
that
it
kid
on the other
individually.
side, from the school's perspective, I think it's probably hard for a lot of schools to do that individualized approach for each student. So if you have because I mean, the schools are made to be cookie cutter, right? You have the general population of students, and they have this one approach that they use for all of the classes, right? Because it's a logistics thing, right? You can't. It'd be very difficult to individualize learning for each student, but they treat special needs, I guess, the same way. It's like we just put you in there, and the teacher does their best to work with what they have in there.
How about we actually prioritize that in this country, opposed to just we're going to get you.
Like I said, I think it's probably a logistical and financial thing. It's like you can only dedicate so much time to each individual student, which is why people like Emily exists. So
yeah, that's true. You found a spot where you could be helpful, and you're being helpful in such a way. I think it's just kind of a shame because there's a lot of countries, especially European countries, that focus and fixate on education more, and like the level of education and the amount of money they put.
We're going to
towards
fix it. We're
education.
getting rid of the Department of Education.
Oh my good God.
Whole other conversation.
Yeah, let's sidestep that real quick.
I'm sarcastic, Emily. It's okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
like
I know. Eh?
not that wouldn't be kind of topical for what we're talking about, because Department of Education does affect all of us in that
Especially
regard.
Well, from what I understand, most of the money that goes to public schools from the Department of Education goes to special needs. Obviously, a large amount of money that they spend goes towards colleges. It's mostly college, not as much public. But the money that does go to public schools is largely about students with disabilities and special needs and things like that.
Yeah, they definitely need more money then. Like a lot more. So anyway, I said let's sidestep. So let's do that.
Sure.
I told you we're going to go all over the place.
That's okay.
Yeah. So obviously we're two autistic adults. I also was diagnosed with ADHD. But have you ever have you ever thought that maybe you're neurospicy or?
What a segue on that. What a
I've actually
segue.
never heard that term before.
Oh.
I do think that I am, my mother got into the field because her brother he had dyslexia and probably some other learning challenges. So that's kind of how I got into it. We certainly work with all kinds of neurodiverse students, many who have both autism and ADHD and many others.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I have it myself. I think we all have our strengths and weaknesses, though.
I don't know. I apologize if that was too personal of a question. I just, I was curious, a lot of people that are interested in special education or interested in something very specialized. A lot of them, there's a lot of people on the spectrum. So,
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are the neurodivergent.
yeah.
Although every time I say that word, I immediately remember the movie Divergent. Yeah. I'm going to
Right.
stop talking about random book series. Okay. So,
Okay.
Emily, so one of the other things you mentioned in the email that you wanted to talk about is from the parents' side. How can parents advocate for their children, especially in the context of the show, autism, ADHD?
Sure. So, I'm a believer that a parent always knows their child best, and a parent should always be their child's best advocate. If their child has autism, ADHD, any other learning disability, parents should really initially, from the get-go in the beginning of the school year, reach out to their child's teacher, set up a meeting, go over if they have an IEP or a 504 plan, go over that with the teacher, make sure they know what's worked for their child in the past, what hasn't worked, and then set up a plan for communication. Because a lot of times I see that A plan might be working really well for a child, and then 4 months later, everything changes and nothing's working. And sometimes the parents don't know about it right away because they're not communicating until they get a promotion in doubt letter or they see their child's report card. So I think really being proactive, communicating with the teacher, and just constantly observing and watching their child is so important in their whole education journey.
I think one of the things that we've been talking about recently, we've seen, I don't know how familiar you are with different online communities, online spaces. Obviously, they can be very toxic at times, but it seems like there's kind of a push. There's conflicting ideas when it comes to parenting. And I've seen a lot of people online say things like, oh, if your child is autistic, they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do X, Y, or Z. And it seems like there's some reluctance from some people to push their kids at all. And I think our stance is generally that you need to have some level of there needs to be some level of challenging or pushing your child, because if you don't,
dose of nudging.
if you don't, then they might never, you might not know what they're capable of unless they experience any sort of adversity or challenge, right? So just because they're autistic or they have a certain disability or special need doesn't mean that you should never challenge them at all. I don't know if you have any experience with that or people with kind of that mindset.
I totally agree with you. In fact, as you know, just within autism, there's such a wide spectrum. There are students who are completely nonverbal and others who are very smart and have other struggles and everything in between. So I do completely agree that if you don't challenge your child and at least attempt to challenge them, you'll never know if they're capable of doing more than what they're doing in the moment. So, and you can always scale it back if it's not working, but if you don't try, then you'll never know.
It seems like people oversimplify it. It gets oversimplified to like this dichotomy of either you're being abusive and ableist, or you're you're not pushing your kid at all. It's like these two extremes, and there's no gray area in the middle. And people just have this weird mindset where, if you push your kid at all, then you're an abusive parent. And I don't understand where that comes from. It's like,
well, because people have taken it too far. And I think because of the extreme examples, because people like it with any oppositional thought process, right, of two different sides, nobody really hears about the gray very often, the middle ground between the two, because they only really hear about the opposites, right? Because we've heard about helicopter moms, we've heard about people who are way too loose and just let their kid do whatever, but we rarely hear about there you go, good word. We rarely hear about that middle gray area, which is parents who were taught with nudging, and then they want to also nudge their kids a little bit. Because if you think about it, like a person who's not willing to nudge their kid, I keep saying nudge because it's like the nicest way to say push your kid or whatnot, right? But somebody not willing to nudge their kid is also somebody who's not presuming competence. They're looking at their kid having a disability in the negative sense of it, right? And somebody willing to nudge their kid is presuming competence. They're assuming their kid could, and so they try. But I mean, that in itself can also go too far because unfortunately people like obsessively believed in that whole like tough love idea, which went way too far off its own base. What do you think about all this?
Well, I think I agree with you. And I think a lot of it comes back to knowing your child. Try to challenge them, but know your child. If you feel like they're becoming super anxious or overwhelmed or it isn't working, scale it back. And at least you know you tried. But again, if you don't try, then you'll never know if they're capable of doing more.
Right. Like you got to give it a shot. You just got to. Far too many people, especially autism advocates that I've seen, especially recently, like when we first started doing this podcast 2 years ago and I was getting involved in the community, it wasn't as bad, but it seems like more and more autism advocates are pushing, leave the kids alone. The kid will come around in their own time. And there's, to a degree, there is that. But if you're not trying to get them to use an example of math, if you're not trying to help them understand multiplication, if you're not, giving them a challenge, letting them figure out if it's working, then like you're kind of doing a disservice to them.
We had Temple Grandin on the show last year, and she was talking about she met a kid in the airport who was autistic, and the parents were like afraid to let him do anything. And so he tried to get him to go into a store at the airport and buy something on his own.
Right.
So that to help him learn about money and math and how some of that stuff works. But if they're not exposed to any of it, if you're just constantly sheltering them, they're not going to be able to learn anything.
Right. And these are not skills that they learn by osmosis. They have to be taught and given the opportunity to utilize them.
Right. And I always like to say, given the opportunity to fail. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to fail. You actually, as the expression goes, you learn more from failure than you do success. Like, I don't know, far too often, and you said anxiety, if a kid has too much anxiety, I don't understand why we're so obsessive with not having anxiety. I understand when anxiety gets to a certain level, bad juju, nobody can learn at that, and like it's counterproductive. But some anxiety is a good thing.
Yeah,
Like,
if you're about to get
you
on
should
stage and do a
feel
big
it.
performance, it's nervous.
Yeah.
It's normal to be a little bit nervous. You're about to give a
Right.
big speech,
Right.
anything. Or if you're an athlete and you're about to go in, a championship game, of course you're going to be nervous. Anxiety is normal.
Yeah,
Right.
it should be there. We should have disappointment. We should get a bad grade and go, oh, maybe I should work a little harder.
Yep.
Right? Like we should feel those things at time. It's how we process it and it's how we recover that's the important part. But sometimes parents, I know in my experience dealing with parents at times, they were not willing to let their kid feel either one of those much at all. How do we create an environment where my kid won't be anxious at all, won't be nervous? Well, it's good to know how to deal with that. Like,
And that's part of life, by the way. If you
Yeah.
shelter them and prevent that, then all of a sudden they go into the real world, and then
Right.
we have all these major mental health issues because they can't function on their own.
yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking to a parent when I was working in elementary school, and the parent said, well, they're never going to get a job and have their own apartment anyway, so why do they need to learn that? Because I was trying to make the point you just made. And I said, well, whether they have their own apartment or whether they get a job out in the world, they still have to live in reality. They're still going to be an adult. And even if you're by their side 100% of the time, they still have to process their own feelings somehow. But by you being there trying to stop it before it happens, you're actually doing a disservice to the human being.
Yep.
You know?
Need to build up some emotional calluses.
Yeah, if you will. We could call them, also building coping skills. We can say that too, emotional calluses.
Sorry.
Jesus,
You don't like my flowery language?
Yes, I really do. I love it. I love it. Build those emotional calluses. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like playing guitar, You
Yeah,
build calluses on your fingertips.
I
from
get the
playing.
idea.
You
and
practice.
You're absolutely right. Conceptually, I just really think it's interesting saying that because somebody's going to clip that out one day and just be like, Steve said be unemotional.
I like to speak in metaphors.
You do. You do.
Sorry, I forgot my next question now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I derail you?
A little bit. It's
I
okay.
have a tendency of derailing people. My bad.
So I wanted to dig into, well, you still have a little more time to dig into some of the specifics. So are there some examples you can give us, depending on the child's needs, like certain approaches, certain for either for what you guys do at EBL or also for parents individually one-on-one? I'm just curious about some of the specific approaches.
Sure. So we pull from about 22 different research-based techniques, depending on what's right for each student. So there's so many strategies, so many techniques out there. And again, part of it depends on what the issue is. But just to give you some examples, if we have a student, for instance, who struggles with time management, one strategy that we might teach them is the estimated time versus the actual time strategy. So let's say they have a one-page math worksheet that they need to get done. Well, we ask them, how long do you think it's going to take to complete that math worksheet? And they might say 20 minutes, and we have them write down the ET, which is 20 minutes in this case. And then we keep an eye on time, and we note how long it actually took them to complete that math worksheet, which might be 45 minutes. And we find that usually in the beginning, there's a big discrepancy between the estimated time versus the actual time. But as they practice the strategy and take note of those times start to merge together and they become much more realistic with their time. So it's really about teaching these strategies to them and then showing them how to apply it to their life or to their schoolwork to really help them make that connection.
It sounds like that would be very useful for people with ADHD. It's a common thing is time blindness or not being able to manage time. I found one thing with ADHD, and I don't know how this would apply to learning, but it's setting reminders or alarms or putting things in your calendar so you have something to reference. So let's say I'm in the middle of doing something and I'm losing track of time. If I have a reminder pop up and say, hey, you need to do this in 15 minutes or you need to do this now, it's a way to like, oh, okay, I like, break that. I don't know what you would call it when you're fixated or you're focused on something. It's a way to break that. And because usually with people with ADHD, when they lose track of time, it's usually when they're focused on something, right?
Yep.
If you're in the middle of, let's say I like to do video editing, which I do a lot of video editing. I'm working on a project. I feel like it's been half an hour and it's been 2 hours have gone by and I don't even realize it.
Yeah. No, I love the scheduling notifications, and we use those a lot. Those pop-up reminders, 15 minutes until your next appointment or whatever it is, really, really can help a lot.
Something that I got taught at a very young age. I'm not even sure why I was taught this, but somebody had me look at a clock, watch a clock for 60 seconds. I wasn't allowed to say or do anything else but look at the clock for 60 seconds, just so I understood, or so I had a feeling or sense of time passing. And it, like, I don't know if it was good or bad or what the 100% point it was, but as I've gone through life, it actually has helped me time manage better because I had a much better understanding of what 60 seconds was, and I could extrapolate the rest of passing time that way. It really did let me keep track of stuff a lot better. Yeah. I can't imagine that was evidence-based in any way, but
60 seconds is a lot longer than most people realize.
oh, it's infinitely longer than most people
Especially if
actually realize.
you're closer to a massive object.
Really going into physics, are you? All right. Yeah.
Okay. So another specific example, maybe. Do you have any specific examples related to autism? Some of the challenges to teaching an autistic child. What are some specific examples of approaches or methods that you would use with an autistic child?
Sure. So again, there's a wide range, wide spectrum, but for students who, for instance, might be on the higher end of the spectrum, and we find that a lot of those students are very good at the mechanics of reading and spelling. They struggle a lot with comprehension, with inferencing, also with writing. So we'll work on strategies. One strategy, for example, to build reading comprehension skills that we use is a tricolored highlighting strategy, where we first teach students, that when we read, there's 3 elements we should look for. The topic we highlight in blue, and that's 1, 2, or 3 words describing the passage, like World War I or the beach. Then the second element we look for is the main idea, which is what the author is saying about the topic. So if the topic, for instance, is World War I, main idea might be there were many causes for World War I, and we highlight the main idea in green. And then we go through and we highlight the important details in yellow. And we talk about what is an important detail versus not an important detail. So it's really helping them to become more active readers, to actively engage with the text, but also comprehend the material better at the same time. So that's just one example of a strategy that really works.
Now, at some point with that strategy, would you eventually decrease the amount of use of the color, if not discontinue the color usage altogether once they get far enough into it?
It depends on the student. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll start with a passage that's below their reading level so that they can focus more on the strategy and then gradually increase the complexity of the passage. And then other students eventually get to a point where they don't need the highlighting anymore. So again, it just depends on the student.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting too, because when I was a child, I wasn't diagnosed when I was an adult with autism and ADHD. And when I was a child, actually, I was very good at reading. I started reading very young. I don't know if they call that hyperlexia, whatever it is, but I started reading. I had a very big vocabulary for my age, but part of that was I would get fixated. So I started reading. My parents used to get me books when I was very young, and I started reading young. I would get fixated though on words that I didn't know. So what I started doing is I would go look up the word in the dictionary and then find ways to use that word throughout the day. Whenever the situation arose, I would try to find a way to use that word in the context of a conversation where it made sense. And that helped me learn a lot of words. So I had kind of an advantage when it came to reading and in school versus my peers. But even in school though, same thing. I would reading a book and sometimes I would get distracted instead of understanding the big picture of what I'm reading. I'd get distracted because I'm like, I don't know what that word means.
Yeah, the details.
And until I knew what that word meant, I would get stuck on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes there's that over fixation on the individual words. And as a result, you kind of miss out on what's going on in the story and the passage.
But it didn't make me a lot of friends though. So in previous episodes I talked about, I got bullied when I was younger because of the way that I spoke. I had a big vocabulary for someone my age, like in elementary school, and I would get picked on because they thought I was trying to sound smart. I was using big words, and I'm like, they're just words that I'm learning. What the hell? So I actually changed the way that I spoke over time, and I started to use more colloquialisms and slang, and I started changing the way that I spoke because of the way that I was treated.
Right. You started talking more like the common
and now
folk.
it's hard for me to speak the way that I did when I was younger because I've changed myself so much that I can't go back.
Right.
How dare you mask so much? How dare you? I used to think I was smart, and then I met Steve. So as a segue, because I'm not 100% sure where we're at time-wise, but with EBL and with your work, what's the future look like for you guys?
Great question. We're continuing to expand to other geographic regions and to really expand our online platform and really try to reach out to so many other kids and actually adults who need this kind of support, who may not have access to it. I'm also working on developing a writing software program, which is just a great tool for helping students to develop their writing skills. So constantly developing new programs, and like I said, expanding to other geographic areas to try to help more and more students.
So actually, you just made me think of something, and this is just a personal
you're
thing.
Blame her for it. Oh, okay.
No. So one thing. So being when I was younger and I was struggling with social interactions, I was very confused by things. I didn't do well with sarcasm and things like that. I do much better with it now. I'm very sarcastic. I have a good sense of humor. But growing up, there's a lot of things going on socially that I didn't pick up on or didn't understand, being undiagnosed. And I found it much easier to communicate my thoughts and feelings via writing than speaking. And I don't know if that's a common thing that you run into with special needs kids, but I used to write a lot of poetry. I wrote a lot of short stories, and it was much easier to express my feelings that way because I struggled to express myself verbally. And it's one of the reasons why I use a lot of metaphors and flowery language, because it was easier for me to express myself that way than to try to explain it verbally in a way that other people would or would understand.
Sure. And I think when you speak, there's more of that social dynamic, more of the back and forth. Whereas when you're writing, you don't have that as much. So I think that, yes, I do see that. I think it's great that you've self-identified so much and have so much self-reflection on that. But I think there obviously is that social component with autism and the nuances that go on that are not necessarily part of writing.
Yeah. And that's how I actually built a lot of social connections. In middle school and high school, I wrote we had a school newspaper. I wrote in the literary journal, and I found it much easier to express myself that way. And I actually built friendships because of doing things like that. I did art, I draw, painting, being able to write. I did a lot of poetry, and people would read that and they're like, oh, I didn't know that you had this side of you. You had this kind of like depth, emotional depth and all this stuff. And it's like, because you wouldn't know it just talking to me.
Right.
Interesting.
That was just a personal, what she was
Yeah.
saying reminded me of that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the future looks pretty bright for you. You're going to expand, and it sounds that writing part, expanding the app there, not the app, the learning program for writing.
Yeah,
that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, it is an
that
app.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
It is an
awesome.
app.
Have you ever thought
it's
about like
wonderful.
having a maybe not you guys, but or maybe somebody creating a platform or a hub where people with special needs can like post their writing or their, I don't know.
I think it would be great. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if that exists, but I think that would be great and really helpful.
I absolutely agree. That'd be great for people like you.
It just popped
I
into
would
my
have to
head.
record a video.
I don't know if there's probably a platform out there that exists.
probably.
But,
So anyway, I don't necessarily want to take up too much of your time because I know, well, we all got to be somewhere. Like I'm directing a play tonight, so I've got to get to that too. And I know you have somewhere to be as well. But thank you very much, Emily, for coming on. Now, is there any last statements or anything you'd like to tell our audience about that we haven't quite discussed?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation. I think, that I always like to say that having a special need is a gift. Almost everyone has gifts and the potential to be really successful in life. It's a matter of continuing to build the strengths and also build up those areas of weakness. But there's a lot of advantages and a lot of gifts that we all have.
Absolutely. I think Steve is gifted. At least I didn't make a helmet joke. All right. So I still slipped it in anyway. Anyway, Emily, thank you very much for coming on this show. We really appreciate it. Keep doing the awesome work that you're doing. And obviously, more people need to start doing it too, because there's a
we'll make
lot
sure
of
we
people in our
link your.
community.
I'll put all your links in the description of the episode.
We'll make sure all the links are up. And that way, anybody who
are
wants
you
to, they
accepting
can
new
reach out to you
students?
guys. Oh, yeah.
Yes, we are.
I made that assumption, and I'm glad I was correct. Yeah.
Yes.
So anybody listening, feel free to reach out to them. They are EBL Coaching. Check them out. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you for
having
having
me. Have a great day.
You too.